Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful.
Hello, today is Wednesday, April 15th, 2026, and we are here to talk about voting rights and democratic engagement. With us, we are so privileged to have human rights defender Steve David, who is All Voting is Local's Ohio State Director. Steve is a licensed social worker and lifelong Ohioan whose career has focused on democratic engagement and anti-violence organizing. Most recently, Steve served as the Ohio lead for the Bridging Divides Initiative, an applied research lab at Princeton University working to track and mitigate political violence. Here, he provided partners with regular updates on political violence trends and data, monitored actors of concern, and helped found the Ohio Early Warning Table to coordinate rapid response to threats across the state. As the first advocacy director at the Ohio State University College of Social Work, Steve designed nonpartisan voter engagement programming for students and human service agencies, including the CSW Democracy Fellowship, and hosted the Democracy Promise Unconference. While at Ohio State, Steve was also a member of the steering committee of the Columbus Care Coalition at Columbus Public Health, a cross-sector coalition that works to address trauma and community violence by building neighborhood resilience. During this time, he also co-founded the Columbus Safety Collective, an advocacy coalition that launched a ballot campaign to create a non-police emergency response system for the city of Columbus. Welcome.
Good to be here, Asia. Thanks for having me.
We also have Dr. Jon Krosnick as our psychological scientist. Dr. Krosnick is the winner of the Lifetime Career Achievement Award from the American Association for Public Opinion Research and the Nevitt Sanford Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society of Political Psychology. Currently, he's the Frederick O. Glover Professor in Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of Communication, Political Science, Sustainability, and Psychology at Stanford University, as well as director of Stanford's Political Psychology Research Group and a research psychologist at the U.S. Census Bureau. Dr. Krosnick is also a world-recognized expert on the psychology of attitudes, especially in the area of politics. He is co-principal investigator of the American National Election Study, the nation's preeminent academic research project exploring voter decision-making and political campaign effects. His publications explore the causes of people's decisions about whether to vote, for whom to vote, whether to approve of the president's performance, whether to take action to influence government policymaking on a specific issue, and much more. In his spare time, I don't know where you find it, Dr. Krosnick plays drums with the contemporary jazz group Charged Particles and the Latin jazz group, the Lunar Octet, performing 200 times a year around the U.S. and abroad. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we always get started with our human rights defender. Steve, tell us, how did you get involved in work on voting rights and democratic engagement?
Yeah, thanks, Asia. I think that the shortest answer to that question is, in fact, that I met a girl. The woman who is now my wife was the one that got me connected with the feminist organizers on campus when we first met. And so through that work of doing Take Back the Night events and anti-sexual violence work really exposed me to the power of activism and civic engagement, but then also showed me that I was in proximity to people and all of these stories that I had no idea were happening amongst like my friends and neighbors. And that only by getting in relationship with people could I really understand people's experiences in a different way. And so that was really foundational for me for all the work that came from that. I ended up pursuing a degree in social work as a way to really to pursue those politics as part of my career. Social work is a profession that, as well as kind of the mental and behavioral health work that a lot of people know it for, has a really long and storied history of social action, community organizing, and that kind of political engagement, and was the kind of social work that I always sought to do. which then led me to start my career at the ACLU of Ohio, where one of the first projects that I worked on was one around polling place accessibility. And so, similar to the feminist organizing I was doing, this was an issue that put me in touch with people and some of the barriers that they experienced that had been completely invisible to me up until that point in my career, where I started to see the way that, changing and consolidating polling places was creating significant barriers for folks in my community, as well as getting in touch with an entire legacy of organizing and activism that I had no idea about previously. And so that kind of knowledge of getting in relationship with folks around an issue, listening and hearing to stories, and then taking the time to understand people's perspective and lived experience in a way that's not match my own, is something that I've tried to carry through my career since then. So, as you said, in my work at Ohio State, I did a lot of work in the health and human service sector around doing voter engagement for folks who are providing direct client work, both with students as well as like social workers and other human service practitioners. And so that work again is so relationship based. Is about finding ways to answer like the why does your vote matter question, which is often so deeply personal to people. And by having some of those relationships that existed through a pre-existing therapeutic relationship could allow us to engage in legal and ethical ways to like open the door for people who are who have like plenty of political opinions but have maybe never been connected with the resources to make sure they're registered, to know when voting is happening, and to really facilitate the nuts and bolts of that process for them. And so the other piece of that work for me has always been one that is like this thread around anti-violence that I took up through my work with the Columbus Care Coalition, the Columbus Safety Collective, the work that I did at BDI around monitoring political violence. And so to me, like, is so many of these things are encapsulated in this moment we're currently in, where we see these threats of authoritarian consolidation, these threats of like violence and intimidation, like showing up at polling locations. And so I'm deeply grateful to continue to be around so many powerful pro-democracy advocates and democracy defenders here in Ohio, and excited to be able to continue on this work with them in a really critical election year.
Thank you, Steve. Jon, tell us a little bit about what you study in plain language and how did you get involved in this work?
Before I go further, let me just say that you made a great choice of guests today for this program, because I have in common with Steve not just growing up and spending time in the Princeton, New Jersey area where he was, but also spending 18 years on the faculty at Ohio State in Columbus where he was. So we have a lot in common in terms of the experiences that we've lived. So the work that I have done over the years, and I think that intersects with Steve's interest and expertise, is really in the psychology of mass political behavior in America. As an undergraduate, I was fascinated with research projects that I was a research assistant on, having to do with how Americans think about policy challenges facing the country and the government. And that led me to learn, as a social psychologist, about how people form and change opinions, how they influence each other, how they create evaluations, and how they translate their evaluations into action. And my dissertation and much of my career has been spent studying passion in politics, particularly the idea that for a remarkable number of voters, a particular policy issue becomes tremendously important to them personally. That whether the woman who created Mothers Against Drunk Driving had a horrible experience with losing a child to drunk driving, or gun owners who see the relation of gun policy to their ability to carry out recreation the way they want to, or young women who see a relevance of the issue of abortion to their ability to live their lives the way they want to. What we have found is that a remarkable number of Americans fall into what we call an issue public, a group of people who wake up in the morning, open their eyes, look across the pillow, smile, and say, "Good morning, gun control. Another day, another opportunity for me to do something about you." And the people listening to this conversation today may well fall into that category. And we have been over the years not just collecting examples of people who very willingly describe the fact that they became engaged in politics because of some issue that connected very strongly with them personally, but we've been, as social psychologists, studying, once you are passionate about an issue, how do you gather information about it? How do you think about information about it? How do you form your preferences about what you want government to do and not to do? How you communicate those preferences both through lobbying groups who try to influence government, as well as how you communicate your preferences by voting. And so that I think we have a pretty good understanding of that process, which links into the psychological literature on attitude strength. But the political psychology research group at Stanford has studied many different aspects of political psychology, as you mentioned. So there's an entirely freestanding program on how approval of the president rises and falls over time in response to events, and we're seeing that be particularly important right now. And a big chunk of what I do is focused on optimal research methodology. I learned early on in my career that I did not want to be the scientist who got caught having maybe accidentally making a mistake in the way I did my research, so that the conclusions I reached were artifacts rather than real. And that led me to become fascinated with how the way we collect data, the way we phrase questions and questionnaires, the way we draw samples of populations, the way we compute statistics, there are better ways and less good ways to do all that. And so I've devoted a fair amount of time to trying to understand those best practices and to help disseminate the implementation of those practices. So to the extent that when Steve is doing his work, he's looking at our academic literature for guidance, we're not telling him misleading information. We're really telling him information that'll be valuable.
I want to know exactly what information you're referring to. I'm very curious to know about some concrete things that Steve might be using uh, to his knowledge, or maybe not to his knowledge, that come from research you may have done. But first, I've got to stop and pause on this issue of what voting means to people. So, Jon, you were talking about how often people get involved in the democratic process because of a personal connection to an issue that reflects their ability to live free from violence, their ability to control their destiny, their ability to pursue happiness. And Steve, you said voting is very personal for people in the work you do. What do you see? What does that mean for your work?
Well, I would definitely like the way that Jon frames this really resonates with me, and the way and the different spaces that I've been in throughout my career, and how that deep connection to an issue that really animates people engaging with something over the long term, which is the only arc that I've ever seen actually move policy, is by people who are dedicated to something much beyond an individual election cycle, but really commit to something. I've seen that as the motivator to get people engaged. So much of the work that I'm doing now at All Voting is Local is really making sure that when the time comes to be able to vote to decide what actually happens in the formal policy space, that people aren't encountering barriers, particularly because of ascribed identities to them, that people are not encountering identity-based barriers, that they're not encountering barriers based on their zip code, their race, their demographic statuses, that we can still live in a country where the people of this country pick our leaders. And there's so much of the threats that we're seeing now in this current moment, which is very much looks like one of concerted authoritarian consolidation, where the regime in power is trying to block certain people from voting in order to hold on to power. Plus, there's this foundational American truism that people want to be able to pick their own leaders. And so I think that what Jon has spoken to about what animates people to get engaged with an issue, All Voting is here to make sure that when it's time for us to be able to cast a ballot to say who is going to support my issue or not, that everyone's voice is able to be part of that process, and that people aren't being blocked from participating because of a regime that has certain ideas about the right people choosing the right voters.
So tell us a little bit about what processes, procedures can facilitate equitable and just participation in voting.
So one of the ways that shows up for us right now is All Voting works really closely with local election officials to make sure that our systems are functioning the way that they should, and that people should, and that our dedicated community servants who run our county boards of elections, and keep elections operating, that those folks are able to do their jobs free from interference, and are supported in doing so. So, one of the ways that this looks for us in Ohio is we're monitoring the implementation of new stricter voting laws that recently passed in our state. So, Ohio, in recent years, has continued to, the legislature has continued to chip away at people's ballot access. So, narrowing the window for early in-person voting. In 2023, Ohio became a state with one of the strictest voter photo ID laws in the country. And now in this primary election that's coming up, we're monitoring a law that requires back-end database checks with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles data and the federal SAVE database. And so what we're seeing is that like flaws in these databases and places where like the way that they collect data is not the same has the potential to force people into provisional status where they won't be able to vote a regular ballot or will have to go and cure their ballot at the Board of Elections afterward. And so for us, we're trying to stand in that election administration space to stop these kind of unnecessary barriers from disenfranchising folks. Because what we saw after voter photo ID passed in Ohio was this spike of 10,000 provisional ballots being rejected because folks didn't have this new form of ID. So we have the evidence that when they pass these laws, people lose their voice and become disenfranchised. And so we're trying to work on a county level as well as with statewide partners to be able to make sure that doesn't happen.
Let me ask Jon the same question, but from his vantage point. What does the psychology research say about how to improve access to voting or how to get people involved in the process?
Well, let me put the wisdom of Steve's comment in context, because political scientists in particular have been very interested for a long time in why some people vote in democracies and some people don't. And I think it's worth going on the record at the moment that startlingly, in presidential election years, only about half of Americans who are eligible to vote actually vote. And in off years, when the president is not running for re-election, turnout is often 20 to 25%. And in local elections where even less visible races are on the ballot, turnout is even less than that. So vast majorities of people who have the right to vote are not voting. And an interesting question, that arises from that is why? Why is it? Are these folks not paying attention? Are they not aware? Do they not have preferences? Do they see the candidates as all identical? Do they see government as so inertial that that kind of doesn't matter who's in charge? It's going to be kind of doing the same things from year to year. And our work really is inspired very importantly by the political scientist economist Anthony Downs, who proposed an equation, a really simple equation, to explain why a particular person might vote, and which he said it's really the benefits of voting minus the costs of voting that determine the likelihood of participation. And I think Steve's talking very importantly about the costs of voting, because we have lots of evidence that if government puts up barriers to make it difficult to figure out how to register, makes it difficult to register by having an early deadline, for example, for registering, and as we're now seeing, instituting requirements for more and more documentation to demonstrate eligibility, that translates into lower voter turnout rates. And in places where the state government, which of course runs the process on a local basis, allows same day registration, allows registration on election day, and straightening out the eligibility of the voter for sure afterwards, that we see higher rates of turnout. And so that kind of makes sense, that as you erect barriers, that those barriers are going to discourage the behavior. On the positive side, kind of what are the benefits that might motivate somebody to vote? One way to think about benefits is the voter's potential impact on the outcome of the election. And Downs in particular proposed as part of his equation that it's really an issue of the letter B as in boy times the letter P as in Paul, which what he referred to was the benefits that the voter might gain from their preferred candidate winning times the probability that that voter voting would cause those benefits to occur. In other words, what's the probability that I will make the difference between my favorite candidate winning and not? And I think you don't have to think very hard to realize that P, that probability, is zero. That we do not live in a place where elections are routinely won by a single vote. And so that, although that logic makes sense, that can't be why people vote. That they may think that they could be the single vote that would make a difference. And we are certainly seeing closer and closer election outcomes as the years have gone by. And what matters, of course, is not whether P really is zero or whether the voter thinks that P is zero. But, of course, the key here is that the voter does need to see a difference between the candidates. And so if activists are going door to door and trying to encourage potential voters to participate in an election, one of the ways to do it is to highlight the differences between the candidates and to say, look, there is a real choice here. However, I think it's important to acknowledge another complexity here, which is that at least with regard to the U.S. Congress, this is not so much true in all other elements of government, but in the U.S. Congress, increasingly in recent years, we have seen a level of what you might call partisan obedience among elected representatives, such that the party leadership tells them all how to vote, and they vote that way. And there are very few people, like Susan Collins being an example, who is willing to buck that instruction, and she's willing to vote away from the party's demands in some cases. But the threat these days from the parties is that, congratulations on being elected to the Congress. We're going to be telling you how to vote, and it's your choice. You decide how you want to vote. But as long as you participate in ways we hope you will, we will continue to support you with financial support. On the other hand, if you choose to depart from our instructions, then good luck to you. And we may at some point choose to primary you out by choosing to back a candidate who is more willing to follow our directions. And what that means is it doesn't really matter what a candidate says during an election about what she or he favors or will support, because for the most part, all you need to know is R or D. Is this person going to vote this way or that way? Now, we don't, of course, I don't mean to downplay the fact that representatives have the potential to write bills, to introduce bills, to try to push the agenda in particular directions. But when bills are up for votes, there's a lot of leadership influence there. And so that doesn't, that certainly says that there are clear differences between the R and D candidates, and that any voter who's not aware of that, educating them about that, might well motivate them to participate. And certainly reminding them that elections are often close, especially presidential elections in battleground states are very close. And so maybe you as an individual may not make a difference. But as my wife will say, if everybody doesn't vote, then we have no election. And her theory for a long time was, if I vote, I will inspire other people to vote and keep the boat floating. And as it turns out, our research shows that's true, that actually voting is contagious, that when experiments have randomly assigned individual people to get a treatment that causes them to vote at a higher rate, such as a mobilization visit on their doorstep, knocking on the door and having a conversation about the election, that actually spreads to other people in their social networks. And so if we want more participation in elections, inspiring one person to vote actually does have spreading consequences. Now, this does raise another issue, and which, if you think about Australia, for example, where every citizen is required to vote there, and the penalty for not voting, in theory, is maybe $400. I mean, it's not a trivial penalty. But as far as I understand it, it's never actually enforced. Nonetheless, turnout rates are very, very high. So you might say, well, the government is compelling people to vote. Is it compelling them to vote intelligently? Is it compelling them to vote with information? Just simply compelling the behavior without the information behind it may not be great. But before I stop answering your question, Asia, let me just finish out Downes's equation by saying I think the most important element of it is the psychic satisfaction from voting, which my wife gets a lot of, and that, kind of fulfilling your obligation as a democratic citizen, fulfilling your obligation if you're going to live in a country that offers you the benefits of democracy to do your little part to participate in the process. That's probably the most significant driver of the decision to vote. Still, it's a puzzle, why so few people do it.
I think, you've pointed to the fact that there's myriad reasons. So Steve mentioned structural barriers, barriers related to IDs and barriers related to timing and getting time off to vote and barriers related to registration. And, John, you've mentioned informational barriers, um, barriers to understanding the differences between candidates potentially or the impact of one's vote. Steve, what are some other challenges that you see in your work?
Yeah, thanks so much. And I was really struck by that benefits minus the cost, like in this particular moment that we're in. And so, I think there's an important through line that we can point to right now about the way our current regime is trying to stop certain people from being able to vote and how we're seeing that happen at different levels simultaneously. So, I would point to the letter sent by Attorney General Bondi to the governor of Minnesota, offering to withdraw federal immigration enforcement agents in exchange for turning over their voter rolls with private voter data. Bills introduced in other states that would mandate agreements between immigration enforcement agents and boards of elections so that, ICE would be like not an outside military force, but like part of their board of elections to allow them to intimidate voters at the polls. To an incident that happened here in Ohio, where a group of Department of Homeland Security agents came to a Dayton high school to question the administration of that high school based on something they had purportedly heard a student say about a volunteer that had come to do a volunteer voter registration drive. So the through line of harassment is like intentionally increasing those costs of voting for people. And so not only is it being done in this kind of like federal shakedown with immigration enforcement agents, but then also, if we look at the most recent executive order that came out of the White House, that threatens to criminalize local election officials, as well as down to like the letter carrier who may be delivering a vote by mail ballot of someone who is not on, this government list, this central federal government list that has been created of who are eligible voters or not. So we see like the regime right now being really intentional about the way that it's trying to increase those costs for people, both as far as like what type of enforcement you will be subjected to, down to like what kind of criminal penalties we may put on these folks that are, like these are dedicated public servants who are like working in our county board of elections or that are trying to like put on elections under immense stress and pressure. It's an increasingly a challenging job. And we see in recent surveys from these folks that, they are experiencing increasing amounts of like threats and harassment. And the way that our election system has been, that like lies are being manipulated for specific political gain or for certain people to try and maintain power in this moment, is a really concerning trend that's happening right now. So I very much I resonate with all the pieces about like this, the psychic satisfaction and like, the way that like having been someone that, has like felt really strongly about votes that I've gotten to cast. And for me particularly happens like on the municipal level, like once you become like a nerd for your city council races, like those are some of the most exciting you vote for. Cause you see the tangible impacts in that way. But so like, I certainly get that piece of it. And that is like, I think my main motivator. But I think it's important that everyone realizes like the moment and the time that we're in, where the regime is trying to up the costs as much as possible in order to control the outcomes that happen.
Yeah, if I can just build on what you've said, and it's really puzzling to me. I mean, I understand why those who are trying to make voting difficult these days are doing it, because there's a longstanding assumption that the Democratic Party has been supported by, let me oversimplify it, the working class, and that those folks have fewer resources and are living more demanding lives just to get food on the table and to get through a week and a month and a year. And so anything that makes voting difficult for those folks may make it just difficult enough that they're not able to manage the resources that it would take to register or to actually cast a ballot. That's old. It's an old way of thinking because with what we might call the Trump revolution, the Trump's first victory in winning the White House was very importantly due to working class voters, many of whom had never voted before, being inspired by a charismatic figure to participate. Those are those same working class people who will find it difficult if barriers are put up in their way to make it difficult to qualify to vote in the future. So it's not at all clear that it would be easy to simply make it harder to vote, therefore the Republicans are going to win more. Now, we're not seeing Democratic politicians or Democratic Party activists doing what we're seeing the Republicans do to try to make voting more difficult, to try to create those requirements of documentation and evidence of eligibility. Now, bear in mind, of course, the other thing that Steve, you didn't say is that it's important to recognize that there have been for now quite a few years assertions of elections being stolen and many, many court cases that have concluded there's no evidence of substantial fraud at all. What I think, Steve, you alluded to this, is that, in other words, those elections officials, I mean, it's not that hard to run an election. You create a ballot, you create an opportunity for people to register. The systems have been in place for decades to figure out who's eligible and who's not. You count up the votes either electronically or manually once the votes are cast. And they're good at this process, but trust me, they are not paid very much at all. And the minute you start threatening the possibility that those people may go to jail by something that's not at all of their fault, then you can easily see people, as we have already, saying, you know what, I've done this enough. I'm retiring. I'm not willing to run elections anymore. And then the question is, what are the consequences when you staff up the election process with people either who aren't experienced or with people who are actually partisan and have an agenda to try to push the results in a particular direction, to try to judge people who are walking into a voting place based upon their appearance about whether I should encourage or discourage this person from voting. There are all kinds of issues that get complicated at that point.
And Jon, I think that one of the ways that we're trying to address that issue of this continually escalating turnover within our local elections within our local elections administration field is All Voting actually runs an election administration pipeline program for students in higher education to expose them to work in this field. And the thing that I hear time and time again, both when I talk to local election officials and from students or other folks that that spend time with these folks, is how refreshing it is to talk to people who are working in our local boards of elections, because they are not hyper partisan. They are, perhaps like the last true believers in the democratic process. They are trying to make the thing operate and are dedicated local public servants. And is this breath of fresh air from what has been so hyper politicized in this attempt to maintain political power by using lies about the 2020 election and ever since then. And so we're trying to show folks on a micro scale what's actually happening in the system, with the hopes that as you spoke about the social pressure of being around other people who are voting, we're hoping that then those young people can go out and be messengers of oh no, I've seen the process. I've gone to logic and accuracy testing. I've seen them do the audits. I've seen how they test the machines ahead of time. And so to build a counter narrative to what's unfortunately become its own cottage industry of election denial. And there are folks who are now part of the federal government who have built careers on these kind of election lies. And they're building their own little cottage industry AI systems to feed to grassroots activists to try and challenge voter registrations or local BOEs. And so there's that whole industry that has spun up around it of the disinformation peddlers and the folks who are, trying to get people to be part of their organizations so that it can fuel their own political rise, has become this unfortunate piece of our election system. And we're trying to push back on that by supporting those local officials who are doing the work day in and day out and showing other people about the good work that's happening in our counties.
I mean, the local election officials aren't doing it for the money because they're not getting paid enough. So it's got to be that they believe in the process and they are honored to be a part of that process. And the more the process, changes to become a partisan process instead of a pro-democracy process, everything gets called into question.
So I kind of want to go back to that question I had at the beginning, Jon, about, lessons from your program of research or any research that might support us in making voting more just and equitable, in supporting people's engagement with the democratic process, or supporting Stephen with some of the challenges he's described. Tell us a little bit about some specific findings from your work.
Well, I'll speak not so much about my own work, but about the larger literature on the causes of turnout. So I talked about Anthony Downes's equation. That's theory. That's some guy with a tie on sitting at his desk making up a story. But what matters, I think, is the empirical evidence that the army of scholars in universities mainly have come up with over a period of 7 decades to understand why some people vote and some don't. And in addition to the barriers of practicality that we've already talked about, what our literature has shown is that there are various relatively fixed characteristics of people that make them more likely to vote or not. So having more formal education in schools makes you a voter. Being older makes you a voter. Having more money makes you a voter. Moving from one residential place to live to another residential place to live reduces the likelihood that you'll vote. Getting married makes you more likely to be a voter. So those are kind of, attributes of lives that are separate from politics, but that have consequences. Some of the causes of turnout are characteristics of people, but ones that Steve and people like him who are interested in promoting turnout can't really change. So there are some people who have lots of connections to others in their social networks, and some people who have fewer friends. The more friends you have, the more likely you are to vote. That's a characteristic of those people. People who trust other people in general are more likely to vote than distrusting people. And people who have strong party affiliations are more likely to vote than people who are not. Those are difficult to change. Personality characteristics. People who are more selfish are less likely to vote. People who are more religious are more likely to vote. People who are extroverted are more likely to vote. There's even evidence that genetics is partly a determinant, that identical twins tend to vote or not vote more similarly than twins who are not genetically identical. And so these are all things that activists can't control. But what activists can affect to encourage turnout, first of all, is the notion of political efficacy. That people who feel like policy and government is just too complicated for them to understand are less likely, understandably, to try to participate in that process. And so, what can be done so in other words, just saying to people, I hope you'll vote. Vote. You're affected by government. You should vote. That they need to have that confidence that they actually have something to say through their vote. And for people who are issue public members who are very passionate about an issue and they know they want government to take action on climate change, or they know they do not want government to take action on climate change, whatever their preference is, those people have a motivation. But the more people understand how government works, the better, the more likely they are to actually participate. And if you just think for a second, how do we learn how the American government works? I mean, we get taught a bunch of like structural stuff when we're in school, but are we really being taught about all of the government agencies that are out there at the federal level, the state level, the county level, the local level? Who are all those people? What do they do? What's the evidence that they're actually making life better for people? I would argue that the government in America doesn't have a press agency that's working to try to promote public understanding of what they do. And the fact of the matter is, as someone who is a government employee, I work for the Census Bureau. I've seen behind the scenes. It's amazing to see how many people are like the elections officials who Steve described earlier, who really are dedicated to the betterment of life for all Americans. And whether it's people in the Department of Education in Washington, or people in the Department of Agriculture in Washington, or the Department of Justice in Washington, and so many other government agencies, they really need like a publicity agent to not only educate the public about what they're doing so the public sees things, but also to help people feel a level of confidence that they understand what they're actually voting for. And, to some extent, somebody, and I'm not clear who this should be telling the public it does make a difference whether Democrats are in charge or whether Republicans are in charge. And there obviously have been very big changes in the last year since President Trump took his office for the second time. So, people paying attention would see that. But on the other hand, there's still a federal government and there's still a Justice Department and there's still a military, and a lot of things remain the same. So how do you create that sense of efficacy and knowledge? I think, creating a sense of civic duty, that's another determinant that people who feel that living the privilege of living in a democracy means you're obligated to participate. That's going to be hard, without shaming people. But the good news is that whatever strategies we've talked about so far that might inspire somebody to vote, voting becomes a habit. And as I said earlier, if you get people to vote once, then they're actually quite likely to continue to vote after that. So that's a good thing. You don't have to keep working year after year after year. But, among the most important determinants is seeing a difference between the candidates and perceiving the race to be close. And so maybe your activity, your participation could make a difference. And I think those are all actionable strategies for activists who want to encourage participation. But again, like we want participation from people who are well informed, not so much that people are voting just to vote.
Steve, I saw you nodding vigorously when Jon was talking about, how do we learn about what government does for us, and where do we get that information, and do we need a press secretary for the government? And tell me about your thoughts.
Yeah. So I think I think my vigorous nodding was probably related to the fact that I'm a dad to two small kids right now, and so seeing like the way in which they're instructed about different branches and stuff, but as someone who is like a dyed in the wool believer about democracy, for me there's a piece where there's formal democracy out there, but there's the democracy that we engage in by getting outside of your house and participating in your community. And so I'm thinking about the differences in the way that I try and teach it and build that sense of efficacy of that we get to make choices, and these choices impact our lives, and that as someone who is definitely a member of the issue public that Jon has described, trying to make those connections for folks is at least how it shows up in my household. I feel like my other big endorsement there was as the father of small kids who just took them to a national park over spring break. Man, is there something that just shows you we can actually do good things and solve problems with government, and can build some incredible stuff with it. If we're making some of the right choices around that. So those pieces definitely resonated with me. But this the other piece around voting being a habit, and also just the very basic stuff about that, having the knowledge to participate. When I've been when I've talked to other folks in the pro-democracy space, and I've seen some of the data on what happens with what are effective get out the vote efforts, that people need those they need those concrete pieces. And so as someone who has done right now I help with our election protection network, which trains volunteers to go to polling places to identify problems, long lines, or it hasn't opened up or something like that. But as someone who has been a poll monitor myself, near the Ohio State campus, where here in Ohio, polls close at 7:30 p.m. And to see 3 different students between 7:30 and 8 come to vote, had made the decision it was worth their time, but came after polls close and be oh, I thought it was open until 8. Just points to some of these things where there are just practicalities about giving people the resources to participate. And as a social worker who a piece of what we say often is, people being experts in their own lives and trusting people to know those things. I'm a true believer in let folks participate. And that I think most Americans do still believe that they want all eligible voters to be part of the process. And so I really am a believer in getting people that information to let them participate, and then trusting them to, do what is right for them. I just think of folks rolling up to the polls after they've been closed, and oh, there's like always more work that we can be doing as voter advocates to make sure folks are encountering that are not experiencing barriers, either formalized ones that we talked about previously, or just being a new voter who legit doesn't know that the polls close at 7:30.
So we're coming up toward the end of our time together, but I asked Jon, tell us about some, actionable things from research you're familiar with. I want to ask you, Steve, as somebody who has done voter engagement programming, as somebody who's worked the polls, what do you want scientists to know? What are you seeing on the ground that scientists are missing or need to be aware of?
You know, so I'm not gonna purport to like know things that like Jon has pretty extensive scholarship here, so I'm not like I'm not gonna purport to like see things that are like missing from his analysis. But I do think like a couple of the questions that like come up to me are these ones around like how people internalize election lies and this like cottage industry of election denial is like one that is like actually like really fascinating to me right now. Ohio has a like connected and mobilized and I think very civically passionate election denier network right now that has been showing up in our counties trying to get people removed from the voter rolls. And so I'm curious about like what and some like recent data that I've seen about like the relationship between like people who are heavy social media users and how they feel about other like democratic norms. And so I think that in that like that information literacy space is one where I think there's a lot of room for us to like still do good work, particularly in terms of how we're like educating young people like of all stripes. I did mis and disinformation trainings for social work students and health and human service practitioners as part of my previous work. And there are certain just like baseline competencies that I don't think have ever been like formally instructed to a lot of people about just like some of these like, but is it real type things? And, it's so interesting to me to like hear an actual like scholar talk about these things in this atmosphere where like so much expertise has just like been rejected, and that like, Jon said always dedicated part of his career to like making sure he's doing good science. And we're in an environment right now where somebody like, oh, well, whatever, like, it's all lies, they're all making it up. And so the fracturing of the information ecosystem is something that I think we are going to need to continually attend to, is obviously being accelerated, by large language models and AI and all those kind of things. So really like coming up with like what are some best practices for how we can be inoculating folks like against bad information and intentional manipulation so that our democratic processes can function better because we're operating under a shared set of realities.
Actually, Asian, if I can add to that, I'll just say that I'm embarrassed on behalf of academic researchers that election denial is such a major challenge these days. And yet, if you go into Google Scholar and you try to find academic scientific papers that have tried to understand why are people election deniers, we got nothing. We've got very, very little work that has explored that, despite the fact that it's so important. And I think to just explain partly why that happens, that and this, Asia, I don't need to tell you that academics tend to take on big questions, and understanding big questions takes time. You've got to collect data, you've got to analyze data, you've got to go through the peer review process, and to get funding to support your work takes time. So when we grab onto a question, we tend to ask a question that's had long-standing importance and where we know that by the time we come up with an answer, people are still going to care about it. And unfortunately, election denial is such a new phenomenon that we as a group of scholars have not yet embraced that to truly try to understand it. But I will say one thing, that there is a bit of work that suggests that the people who are election deniers also tend to think that we never landed on the moon, and that the moon landing was staged on a stage in Arizona or New Mexico. And so there are the conspiracy theories. It gets complicated when you start talking about conspiracy theories. How do you define a conspiracy theory exactly, and how do you measure belief in it? But in this case, this is, if you just simply strip off a lot of that baggage and just talk about how many people are willing to entertain the idea that the votes have been miscounted in 2020, for example, I wish we knew more. And I think
Mm.
to the extent that Steve is putting a finger on a really important barrier for some people who say, look, why would I vote? Because I just can't trust the system to count my votes accurately. The minute that, I mean, honestly, I'm not even sure why, on a partisan basis, the fact that the election deniers tend to be on the Republican side and not on the Democratic side, why does talking the American public into doubting the validity of election vote counting help Republicans win elections? That's not even clear to me. So I think we should, it be inspired by you, Steve. We should take that question more seriously and work on it to be able to understand this very consequential phenomenon.
I hear in there a message too for funders. We need rapid funding on election denial phenomenon, as well as continued funding on mis and disinformation, debunking, pre-bunking, inoculation, and all of the things. So, Steve, Jon, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and time with us. Thank you for everything you're doing to support the democratic process and make voting equitable for all people.
Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.